This is Mark Stoddard and Leanne are the co-chairs. I think we're going to get started. I'd like to just do a very brief introduction. I kind of became aware of this a few minutes ago. Donovan will have been with the Tennessee Small Business Environmental Assistance Program for 25 years as of January 4th of next year. So that's an important milestone. Donovan seems to serve in a myriad of roles. He's the NSC chairman. He's serving on a number of subcommittees. In fact, actually, it might be better just to figure out what he's not serving on. He seems to do it all. He writes the comment letters. He corresponds with various people. He would be one that we would sorely miss if for some reason he were to leave his current position. So I say hats off to Donovan. With that, take it away.
Well, thank you, Mark. And currently no fear of losing me anytime soon, as I just told Leanne. Yeah, I'm about to hit 25 years, still expect another 20 to go. So I'm going to be around for a while, hopefully. But anyways, so today we've been talking a lot about different ways of reducing pollution, such new techniques and everything. One of the things that sometimes some of us may have had questions about is recycling of solar panels. Many of us have been out there or may even have solar panels on our own home or be getting some level of solar power. But what happens to these solar panels at the end of their life? How do they work, and why should we recycle them? Now, a lot of us are going to be familiar with little solar panels, like say the ones in our solar powered calculators. You just have a good light, and I want to say this calculator is somewhere over 20 years old. Actually, it may even be older than that. I think I found it in my desk when I started work with TDEC, and it is still lasting. I just got to have a good light source for it. Other solar panels, such as this one right here, this is one that I have had for somewhere around 40, 45, about 40 years. So I got this when I was quite young, and it does still work. In fact, unfortunately, I can't really demonstrate, but this LED I have here, it will light up from that solar panel as long as I have a good light. But if I shine a good light on it, you can't see the LED unless you're really up close to it, and this camera doesn't really handle it. But it's essentially the equivalent of this small little 3-volt battery, but as you see, you can't really see the LED going on. But that little solar panel is fun. But over time, solar panels may degrade and start looking more like this one. This one no longer functions well. It would require a lot of cleaning, but we'll go into the reasons how they work and why they fail like that, and why we should close the loop on our electric sunshine. But so Mark gave a real brief introduction. As he said, I'm with the Tennessee Small Business Environmental Assistance Program. I'm currently ombudsman, chair of the National Steering Committee. I've stepped down from being head of a lot of subcommittees, but I'm still head of the Metrics and National Advocacy Committee work groups. And I am a chemist, a fencer, and an astronomer. The majority of the astronomy pictures that are in this presentation, I took myself. So feel free to ask me any questions about those as well. So let's start with where it all begins, the sun. That's where we get all this solar energy power. And even so, it's like the biggest star in our area. It's still technically just a medium-sized yellow dwarf, though that still outweighs the Earth by a huge amount. It's, of course, very hot, but it's sort of weird in that the section sort of around here, known as the photosphere, is actually hotter than the surface of the sun. So it's like it's really hot in the center, starts cooling as it goes out, cools, and then it starts getting hot again. It's a really weird thing, but it's something to do with how the radiation interacts. That's why it goes anywhere from 15 million up to about 6,000 degrees Celsius. But how many of you have heard that song about They Might Be Giants, about Why the Sun Shines? And how many of you have heard the second song that they did correcting that first one? The sun is not an incandescent mass of, it's not a giant ball of incandescent gas. It is a miasma of incandescent plasma. 91% of that is hydrogen, but it is fusing different things together, making all kinds of different materials. And each second, that's equivalent to 100 billion tons of dynamite. So the sun is a lot of energy. These solar flares, you may have been hearing more and more about solar flares and coronal mass ejections lately, because the sun is approaching what is known as solar maximum. So there's going to be more sunspots, more flares, more coronal mass injections. That can cause auroras. It can also disrupt GPS, knock out satellites so that they no longer work, and all kinds of things. And some of these mass ejections have more mass than the Earth itself. So the sun is just doing huge amounts of things. But from our perspective here on Earth, each square meter of Earth receives about 240 watts of solar energy per hour, or maybe even less than that. So there's all this energy. So what are we going to do? Well, we need to learn how to harness that. So I had a question for everybody. When was the first solar panel for solar generation actually created? So either come off mute or put it in the chat. Nobody's going to jump and ask? Okay, here we go. Okay, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s. Ooh, Jeremy's done his research, 1883. So technically it's slightly older than that, because in 1839, Edmund Becquerel first observed the photovoltaic effect. He found a crack in some silicon crystals, and there was electrical current going through that when they were exposed to light. 1860s was when the first patents for solar-powered engines and solar cells were first being developed, although they hadn't actually created them yet. And as was noted, 1883, Charles Frick created the first solar panel. Now, at that time, it was only about 1 to 2% efficiency. That means it could only convert about 1 to 2% of the sun's energy into actual electrical energy. Then there's multiple patents for solar cells, usable for everything. Then there's also things called thermopiles and thermobatteries. There's a huge slate of those. Now, thermopiles are using two dissimilar metals to create and having a difference in temperature that creates an electrical current. These are essentially the early forerunners of thermocouples. And thermocouples are useful in various probes because if you measure the electrical current, you figure out the difference in temperature if you know the outside temperature. I've done some experimenting with those as well. However, it wasn't until about 1950 that solar panels really started taking off, and that Bell Labs started using silicon. Before that, there's a couple other different things used, but silicon came into real vogue about 1950s and they got up to about 6% efficiency. Then 1973, as many of you might have mentioned, the University of Delaware created the Solar House. And that was supposed to be a demonstration project showing how solar panels could be used to power houses. Until then, They might have used them for calculators, as you saw, like that one's a pretty old one. We started having them back then. But it wasn't until about then that we really started looking at solar energy as a bigger solution. This was also about the time of the energy crisis. So there became a lot of interest in solar panels. And in 1974, the Solar Energy Research, Development, and Demonstration Act was passed to help advance the technology of solar panels. But then the energy crisis ended, and there was a lot of interest dropped. There we go. Trying to adjust my notes slide so I can actually see them. There we go. But in more recent times, so we had 2006 was a solar investment tax credit that many of us may be familiar with. Maybe some of us have taken advantage of it. Right now, I believe it is at 30% again. So if you have a solar project put on your house, the U.S. government will rebate you 30% of that. I can actually even get into how that works if people really want to know at the end. But because I have attempted to get solar on my house, unfortunately, it did not go through. And I'll also get into the issues about that later if people are really interested in that story. But currently, we have around 155 gigawatts of solar power in the U.S. alone, which is enough for about 27 million homes based on average. And that is ramping up massively. So currently, the efficiency rate, as you know, it started about 1 to 2%. In the 50s, 60s, it was about 6%. Now it's up to about 23.6%. There's even some new options, including what is known as glass. So there's glass on both sides, and you can actually catch energy from both coming in from the sun and being reflected up. Getting about 266 watts per square meter. This is actually a commercial type from Suntech. However, recently the newest record's been put out, and that was, I think, in October is they hit this record and published it, 33.9%. Now, this is using something called silicon perovskite. Perovskite was discovered in the Ural Mountains in Russia. And the unique thing about perovskite is, while it was discovered around the 1850s or so, it's more of a structure than a specific mineral. And that can be recreated synthetically. So we can actually create high purity perovskite cells, potentially cheaper, easier, and with more efficiency than silicons. I'll note that this is also above the theoretical limit of single junction cells using just silicon. So these new perovskite cells will have higher efficiency than even silicon. There's even testing for solar trucks where the trailer as well as the truck are covered in solar cells. This website right here, the sunroof of the google.com, can actually give you a direct image of how well your personal roof might work in solar. And it's sort of a heat mapping to show that this location will gain a lot of energy. This one, based on what we can tell, it has more shade. It won't necessarily be as good. And you can also get an idea of how many installations. For example, there's only 289 in the Nashville area. So solar has not taken off a bit in Tennessee, or at least in Nashville. Compare that to over 10,000 in Phoenix, where there's a lot of sun, not a lot of shade. North Carolina actually has I think it's the University of North Carolina, has a really great website called Desiree, and they keep up on incentives for green power, not just for solar panels, but for any type of green power. And it stands for the Database of State Initiatives for Renewable Energy. So it's also estimated that by 2030, 30% of electrical generation will be solar as we keep moving toward it because costs are dropping and installation is rising. For example, between 2009 and 2017, there is a massive drop in the cost. And once we start getting more Perscovite cells and it becomes easier to manufacture them, we may see another cost drop as well as a higher efficiency. Currently, one of the more interesting things is ranch and farmland. It's being rented out. You hear about farmers having all kinds of issues. And maybe not being able to manage all their farmland. And there's that farmland is a lot of open space. They may rent it out to become a solar farm. And there's even locations where, especially livestock and solar panels can coexist. There's also places that plant wildflowers throughout a solar farm and have beehives on the outside and gather a lot of honey. So there's a lot of dual use that you can use with solar farms. So right now, solar industry is considered one of the fastest growing professions in the US at 250,000 installers and growing really quick. Plus, the nice thing is solar panels can offset their carbon footprint for production very quickly, depending on the efficiency. Overall, the annual growth rate is considered about 24% due to federal policies, declining costs, and increased demand. And while I had 250,000 here, according to, I think, some census, as of 2022, so just last year, there's more than 263,000 Americans working in 10,000 different companies, generating about $35 billion of private investment. Even though I had like this price range, there's a few different ways that it can go. Just in the last decade, it's dropped about 40%, especially in comparative to other forms of generation. So you have your large base scale plants, like here in Tennessee, we have TVA with used to be steam powered by coal. Now it's natural gas. Hydroelectric dams. Those are things you pretty much have to be a government to really be able to do. But solar panels, it can be a small business. It is a lot more portable. And it's a lot more accessible. And right now, it only accounts for about 5% of the current electrical mix. So as you see, in the next 7 years, that may change from 5% to 30%. However, efficiency doesn't always mean the best. It mostly means it's more energy generated per area, and therefore you have a quicker payback. However, if you have a poorly made solar panel, it will stop working and you won't get the efficiency anymore. So why do solar panels stop working? There's a couple of different things. Overall, most panels expect to be lasting for 25 years. As you can see, some of the ones I have, they've been going for 30, 40 years. It's mostly due to a couple of things such as light-induced degradation. So when you have the sun beating down on your solar panels all the time, it slowly starts degrading them. Because solar panels, most of the silicon wafers in them, or silicon Perscovite, whichever, are extremely thin. In fact, most silicon wafers are only as thick as 2 human hairs, so maybe 20 microns in thickness. Everything else about a solar panel is to protect that silicon wafer. And the other thing is how silicon works is when the light hits it, it knocks loose electrons, and those electrons flow through the panel in what are through essentially electron holes before they can rejoin with the silicon. That's what creates your flow of electricity from light. That's essentially the photovoltaic effect. But over time, if they don't get enough electrons back, or the light starts causing some issues with what is protecting the solar panels, the solar wafers, or there's actual issues in the solar wafer themselves, that's what the light-induced degradation is. Now, this is expected. It's usually about a loss of a quarter to 7% per year, depending on the manufacturer style. Uh, but eventually it's mostly affects the oxygen in silicon cells, because one of the most common places for silicon is silicon dioxide, i.e. quartz, sand. So there's a lot of oxygen there, but by creating silicon panels, that's what the need is for high purity silicon. So we reduce the amount of oxygen there, and we go for almost pure silicon, but there's still some oxygen traces in there. I mean, we live in an oxygen environment. That's what we need to breathe. So it's going to be everywhere unless you have a good vacuum. You're going to have some oxygen impurities. The industry average is about 82.6% light energy production after 25 years, though some are retained as high as 90.8%, so very little light-induced degradation. The next one is what is known as potential-induced degradation. And this is sort of a long-term failure due to voltage leakage. This is usually around the frame and can be as much as 50% if not caught and fixed. The larger your voltage, so like at large-scale solar farms, it's more common. However, that is what inverters are all about. These inverters can reduce the effect. Most leading manufacturers almost eliminate potential induced degradation, but it can still be an issue. Honestly, most of it is due to general exposure. Whether it's the backsheet failure that lets in water, maybe caused by substandard materials. The one that I showed you earlier that's really messed up, I think that's what happened is water got in there and completely obliterated all the connections. It's probably rusty in there. So that's just an example of not a good manufacturer design. Then after that, we have elevated temperature induced degradation. So you have large temperature fluctuations that can cause issues. It can also cause micro cracks or hot spots where your soldering may not have done such a great job. This is usually the more longer term, more common ways than manufacturer defects. There are still some, or catastrophic failures where like a tree falls on it. Well, hopefully that doesn't happen. Hail, that has a larger thing, but again, like I said, there's a lot of protection put on there. And as I said, solar wafers themselves in, say, this amount of thickness, it's like you have something the thickness of 2 human hairs in there that's actually causing your power. So once a solar panel stops working, that's when we need to start recycling it. So right now we're about to hit the early wave of decommissioned solar panels, because as we noted, it really started about in the 80s. Now we're almost 40 years past that point, or actually the 70s, and now we're 50 years past that point. Maybe not a lot back then, but around 2006, almost 20 years back, that's when it really started surging again. And so we're at the earliest wave, but that's going to ramp up massively. So those that took advantage early on of that 2006 incentive, by 2030, they'll have been hitting their 25 to 30 years, and that's the expected life expectancy of a solar panel. By 2050, we're looking at 60 to 78 million tons worldwide of solar panels needing to be recycled. Some of the older ones may have different heavy metals in them, whether it's lead-based solder, silver, tin, and several others, including some that are considered toxic, like cadmium. I know a lot of us have been dealing with some of these metals, and say 6H, for example. That's exactly why 6H was created, to focus on these rules or these metals. Cadmium, nickel. Luckily, there's no nickel or some of the others there, but lead and cadmium are potentially in solar panels. So once we have reached the life expectancy, how do we actually recycle a solar panel? This is a nice little diagram that I got of a solar panel that shows sort of the breakdown of it. First off, remove the frame and junction box. That's aluminum, fairly easy to recycle. The frame adhesive becomes a little bit an issue because, I mean, it's designed to be watertight. And so it can be very difficult to separate that out. So there's a lot of thermal, mechanical, and chemical processes used to separate that out. After that, we start getting into the glass. Glass, luckily, is a very easy to recycle material, or at least it's been done enough that there's a fairly good industry about it. After that, we start getting to EVA. That's the polymer encapsulation film. That becomes a little bit more difficult because that's a thin film, more than likely. And finally, we start getting into the solar cells itself, and then the metals in behind it, such as tin-coated copper bus bars, some more polymeric encapsulation, and the back sheet, whether that's a plastic or, as I mentioned earlier, glass. And even in the solar cells, you have things like you have silver in there, you have silicon nitride as an anti-reflective layer. You can have cadmium, you can have lead solder, tin solder, all these different metals. So the separation and purification of silicon and the metals can occur via by chemical or electrical methods. You can like use an electrical electrolysis or electrical deposition, a couple of different things like that. Unfortunately, at least in the US, it's still in the early stages with just a few large scale facilities. I said in here none, but in further research, I was finding more options for solar panel recycling than initially thought. But I think most of them still are not technically large scale. Often the facilities that accommodate e-waste are used. There's only one that I found that is dedicated to cadmium telluride cells. These are your thin film cells or amorphous silicon cells as opposed to crystalline. These are the types of cells that you might see in your calculators, or they're designed more for being able to produce energy more efficiently at lower light levels than your silicon ones. They won't have the same output as a silicon cell, but they can handle producing light at a lower light level. So you saw all the different ways of processing it. Now here's some of your issues. Adhesive, maybe the adhesive is hard to get loose sometimes. For example, the polymer seal especially. Aluminum glass, that's about 75% of the weight of a solar panel. That luckily is something that we're used to recycling, as well as the copper, plastic junction boxes. So these are good things about the solar panels. Is this is something that is used to. It's just a matter of taking it all apart. Then we have your more internal components. That's where you start getting to a lot of your metals. Some, because of just how they are and how they're mixed in, it becomes more difficult to recycle. And of course, some are considered toxic. Then, of course, you have your other components that go along with it, your inverters, your racking, your battery backup. Most of this is able to be recycled by standard e-waste programs, or scrap metal, or even battery recycling programs. Some interesting research on that is most commonly the battery backup is most likely to be a lithium ion battery because that has such a high energy density. And current studies are showing that recycled lithium may be better than the initial lithium in an energy capacity. This may be due to such things as progress in the technology for purification, how it's recovered, battery design, or even the recycling process may create more electron holes to allow the electrons to flow better through the lithium. Also, similarly, solar panel materials can be used in more advanced solar panels. So if we're able to recycle silicon or cadmium tellurium or any of the, say, silicon perovskite, as we come up with new technology for the recycled materials, then it becomes more efficient because we're putting them into better designed solar panels. So that's at least one of the hopes that can be done. But here in the US, the clock is ticking. So as of 2030, we're expected to have 1 million tons. Comparison, 2018, the entire U.S. municipal solid waste was about 292.4 million tons. So coming up in 7 years, it's expected to be a sizable percentage. By 2015, the second largest number of end-of-life panels will be in the U.S., about 10 million tons. So getting up to over a percent, or about 2% of the entire U.S. municipal solid waste will be solar panels that need to be recycled. As we have been mentioning before, some panels have enough toxic metals to trigger RCRA rules under subtitle C. Luckily, there is the transfer-based exclusion if your recycling regulations are followed. As of just a few weeks ago, there is a new rulemaking to improve recycling and potentially listed under universal waste. They're not currently universal waste, but if the October proposed rule goes into effect, they potentially could be. There would also be specific tailored universal rules for handling lithium batteries because they are so common. And that's part of the reason for the universal waste rules is how to deal with common different materials that are going to be generated a lot, still are toxic, should be handled carefully, but there's so many of us, like we can't necessarily handle them as we would standard hazardous waste, so we have to have streamlined regulations for. Now, there are several states that already have specific solar panel regulations or policies. There may be more. These are just the 5 states that EPA currently had listed. There may be legislation in other states, and potentially if the EPA record changes go into effect, it could supersede all of them, or at least be modeled after the ones that already have them. So some good things going on there. So what are the benefits of recycling solar panels? And this is not my picture. It's just a very pretty one. I do not have the James Webb telescope to take pretty pictures like that. So the International Renewable Energy Agency estimates that the value of recovered materials could be somewhere between 450 million and ramping up to 15 billion by 2050. This is the equivalent of about 60 million new panels. So people are starting to look at this. They're starting to look at this as serious money. They're starting to like, okay, how can I model my business to take advantage of it? One reason why Mark asked me to even do this presentation in the first place is about 4 years ago, I was asked this question: how can my business recycle solar panels? And so I started doing research about that. Now, luckily, there are a couple of good resources and ideas out there. For example, in the US, probably the leading company that I could find just off the top of the research is First Solar. They are a major manufacturer of solar panels in the US, and they actually plan for how their solar panels are going to be recycled at the end. And they even have a take back program. So it's like, if you buy one of their panels, one, it's designed to be about 90% recyclable, and at the end of its lifespan, they'll take it back so they can recycle it by their own special methods. They are planning ahead for an entire 25 years ahead. They also estimate that their semiconductor material, i.e. the silicon, or in this case, they're one of the primary manufacturers of the cadmium telluride panels, can recycle 41 times. So that's 1,200 years of recycled material. And just think about what advances we might have by then that can make them even more efficient. So they estimated they only recycle about 500 megawatts of material back in 2023. And they were one of the first in the US to establish a recycling program. However, we're still actually behind the ball because in the European Union, there's a nonprofit called PV Cycle. They started in about 2007, and they've actually branched out well beyond the European Union. And the European Union's actually already require a 85% collection and 80% recycling of materials used in PV panels. This is a specific directive that was extended to solar panels in 2012. So that's 11 years ago. And we're just now changing our record rules to where it might not be as much an issue. So that they did attempt at one point to have a program started in the US, but as far as I can tell, it failed because the link off the PV cycle to the US program came to a dead link. So I'm not sure what happened there. Instead, it's left up to more individual companies like First Solar. So we do have a lot of extra additional resources. And like I said, I was a little bit heartened to see how many options there are for recycling solar panels. So this right here, I believe I got from the energy.gov solar manufacturing map, but it essentially shows where in the US are places that need solar panels recycled. Of course, out west where it's more common, there may be a few more facilities. There is one in Tennessee, two in North Carolina, but not a lot more in the Southeast. One sort of in the Midwest area until you start getting into the Mississippi region, the Ohio Valley. Have a few, but honestly, there's still not a lot. There's entire states that don't have any solar recycling options other than e-waste recyclers already. So it's certainly something that there's a lot of gaps out there. And with us looking at more and more solar panels, we really need people to start thinking more ahead. One of my supervisors was at a solar energy conference not too long ago, and even the main speakers were like, yeah, there's no coordination. It's we're just hoping somebody will step up by the time we really need it. It's like, no, we need to plan ahead. So anytime you have a recycling company that is asking about e-waste or solar panel, there are a lot of resources that can be used, and definitely encourage them to get into it. So with that, do we have any questions?
Don't hold back. This is the time to ask. We have plenty of time.
Yeah. I mean, whether it's about solar panels, how solar panels work, the pretty pictures I use, whatever.
Well, while we are waiting, you may have mentioned this, but I may have been distracted. What impact does weather, like water accumulation or accumulation of ambient dirt or dust have on solar panels? And then what would you do to kind of help clean them? Would that be a manual process or automated?
It would typically be a manual process. Dust is an issue about solar panels. I know that when I was looking at getting them on my house, they did suggest a regular maintenance of solar panels, i.e. take your hose and spray them down so you wash off the dust or anything accumulated from like rainwater deposits. But overall, water itself does not affect them unless it accumulates on them. For example, if water sits there and pulls up, then you're going to have an issue. If that's another reason why a lot of solar farms, they're angled in the direction of the sun, but also the angle helps the water run off them so it doesn't accumulate and cause a lot of the water infiltration issues that I talked about as one of the primary methods of how solar panels are degraded. But weather also plays a huge factor. I mean, if it's not a sunny day, you're not going to get a lot of power generation. If it's a really sunny day, yes, you're going to get a lot of power generation. Then Tony, I saw, asked, have you heard of any PFAS used in solar panels? Not directly, but I would not be surprised at all. especially in that if some of the top layers are, say, polyimide layers, to help protect it, and I get it non-stick, so rainwater and other deposits or dust don't stick on it. PFAS, that's exactly what PFAS was designed for, in different ways. Another example is one of the nice, wonderful things about solar panels is if you have a solar panel, you have an electrical generator wherever you go, and it is extremely portable, which is why they use them in space programs. But they coat them with different protective layers. And in the upper atmosphere, you have atomic oxygen that will cause polymer degradation, and that's what causes crazing or milking of lenses. It'll also do the same thing over the top of solar panels, making them less effective. So I'll get to you next, Jen, but Chris asked about hail. Honestly, that is one of the things that they design solar panels to protect against is hail, unless you have really large hail. They test it pretty thoroughly for impact. And as I noted, glass is usually your top layer, and they use a low iron glass, which allows a lot of refraction and reflection of light. So you have more light impacting the solar wafer, but all that glass is designed to help protect that solar layer. So Jen.
Hello. This is a really half-baked idea, but I was just wondering if you had heard anything about doing some like producer responsibility. And what I'm thinking about is like, the paint care collection program where the industry chips in and there's like a program set up to recycle. Have you heard anything about that or similar or initiatives?
I have not directly, but then I would not be surprised if there was some going on there, or at least starting to think about it. So let me stop sharing this. But overall, I would not be surprised that there might be some among some of the associations. I mean, that's one of the things for the European Union directive is they require that level. So there is that circular. First Solar, as an example, does plan ahead for like, let's take our solar panels back. Some of the others companies may also do that, but it may be a more individual company. I was working with a company called Sun Power. I think that's right. It could have been a different one, but they were based in Arkansas, I think. And I think they did have a program for end of life recycling. They'll take them back and recycle them. They also had a lot of other nice things about if the efficiency of the panel is not meeting their initial estimates, they'll correct it, whether they give you some money back or put in a whole new panel for free. Those are a couple of incentives they had. And then Julie, I see, has provided a link where we're talking about more product stewardship, as you suggested, Jen. So it seems there is some work being done on that.
Okay, thanks.
So what else y'all have for me? I am by no means an expert in this, but at least hopefully I can give you at least some ideas of what's going on out there.
So this is me again, Donovan. So I presume if an area were to install a relatively large solar panel array, it would need to be close to the demand. The further you go, the more voltage leakage or power loss would render it less efficient. So I'm assuming you would be planning these arrays maybe near or close to larger population centers, at least relative to the size.
Yes, to a degree. but at the same time, getting away from a population center, then you would have more room. You tend to have more farmland, more open area to build them. For example, it's also a matter of terrain. For example, here in Tennessee, there's not a huge amount in East Tennessee because it's more hilly, more wooded, whereas West Tennessee is where there are more solar farms, and there's definitely a very nice one in between Jackson and Memphis that Crystal has passed many a time. There's not necessarily a large population center right there, but it does take advantage of some of the TVA transmission lines and adds into that, because that becomes one of the other issues is some states are more ready for solar than others. Tennessee is one of the things that is not ready. We do not have what is known as net metering, which is where the electrical utilities will pay you for solar generation above your excess that you provide to the grid. We also have to have a lot of different requirements for if you do hook into the grid. So if it's a cloudy day and you're not producing enough, you still have your lights on, because then you'd be drawing from the grid. And part of the reason for that is if there is a issue with the power lines, say a car runs into a power pole and the electrical crew has to come out and fix it. If you're generating electricity, you're making their system hot while they're trying to work on it. So they have to have breaks so that you won't be causing electrocution of their workers. But typically, yes, they would be closer to the actual residential areas because it will reduce it. One of the other nice things that, in addition to having specific solar for your own home, there's now community solar. That is something that is rising in popularity because not everybody is going to go through the expense of putting in their own solar panels. There's also the issue of installation, worried about whether it starts causing leaks in your roof if you have a bad installer, which is an issue. But if you have the utility district, then they put in the solar farm and you essentially buy panels. I actually own 2 solar panels in what is known as the Nashville Music City Solar. There we go. So this is the website that they have for Music City Solar. And I can actually go in there and look at how my power generation for, say, my 2 solar panels do. And you can see definite temperature and weather changes to it. Okay, so Chris asked, at the end of life of the panel, companies should have a cost to dispose of it, hopefully recycle, or they actually likely make some money back from it. They probably will not make money back from it. They may have a break even. There may be a small cost, but at the same time, it depends, and that may actually be built into the front depending on the contract you have with a solar company, and assuming that solar company stays in business for the lifespan of your panels. Of course, the larger ones should be able to operate longer, or the larger companies will be more robust and stick around for longer, but it's still a very new thing. Michael asked, why could they not make solar panels that operate on both sides? They could flip the panel over and double life of that panel. So yes, one of the reasons why the glass to glass is sort of designed to do that, where they get it from both. But one of the things is as the light comes in, it's hitting the solar wafer. That wafer is extremely thin. So like pull 2 hairs off your hairbrush and stick them together. And that's the thickness we're looking at. It's already pretty much using both sides because it is effectively transparent. Everything else is to help that electricity conduct and make it go to the main junction box, the inverters and everything. So that, unfortunately, if you flip it over, now you're completely blocking your solar wafers, because now you're covering it with all the backing, which used to be silver, sort of like a mirror, for example, or your inverters, your racks, a lot of other things. But there are ways that they have been trying to work on having a double-sided, essentially. There's even, I've heard of what are known as thin film solar panels that can be sprayed on as a glaze on office windows. So essentially you just spray it on there, and then you hook a few contacts to the side of your window, and your window suddenly becomes a solar panel. It's not a very efficient one, but considering how much glass coverage some buildings have, it may be. So Jacob had asked, will the change to perovskite cell technology require a substantial change in current solar panel recycling methods? I don't think so. I'm honestly not sure, but it's primarily the silicon perovskite material itself that would be the main change. So just that wafer that actually produces electricity will be where any changes occur. But because it is going to be very similar to the silicon cells that are already in existence, I don't think there's necessarily going to be a substantial change in recycling method. But that would honestly be a question to ask somebody who's actually in the recycling business. So definitely some good questions there.
So Donovan, this is me again. You mentioned the spray-on application of the solar film to windows on maybe the exterior surface of the building. Are you seeing any renovations of buildings with lots of glass area with this type of technology?
Honestly, no. It is something I heard about quite a long time ago. I have not seen anybody actually pursuing it. I don't know if it's even still something out there. I would like it to be, because it seems make perfect sense to me. But again, it'd be a matter of how well can you rig up as an electrical conduit all the glass in a office building. Would it cause radio interference with electronics? I don't know. There may be some issues that I'm not aware of as why this hasn't really taken off. But I agree. I think it would be a great idea if it worked well.
So with that being said, I'm not certain about the technology, but there is a private college in Indiana that employed some type of solar technology on one of the buildings they renovated. I don't recall whether they were going for LEED certification or not, but it was part of their sustainability program. I'm kind of wondering if maybe a number of other universities and colleges might be, from a sustainability perspective, looking closely at solar, not only as far as panels, but maybe onto their building, say like on their windows.
Potentially not on the windows, but one of the things I've been seeing for a lot, say here in the Tennessee area, we have something called the green power switch. And essentially what that is individuals or businesses can say, I want my energy produced by a greener mix, and I'm willing to pay a little bit extra for it. For residential, it's approximately $4 per 150 kilowatt block. And there are some universities, say the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, that have gone almost completely green because the student body voted to say, we're willing to have an extra cost on our tuition and our residency for our energy to be developed from green power. Now, of course, in the early start of this, it wasn't necessarily actual green power, but it helped fund that. And so now we're seeing more things, say like Music City Solar, various TVA solar farms, and it is certainly ramping up. I would not see a lot of universities, unless it is a brand new building, converting over to using more solar, because they want to keep the older aesthetic of a university. But if they are having to completely tear down and build a new building, I can certainly see them considering it.
Donovan, this is me again. I don't know if I'm monopolizing. I don't know if there's anyone in the chat. I guess not.
Yep,
Um,
there's a new question there.
So you see power plants trying to, I guess, lease or purchase solar areas to offset some of their NOx emissions?
That's entirely potential. I mean, that's one of the things why TVA is able to convert over into solar is they have a lot of land around some of their plants. For example, where all the coal ash residuals used to be, coal combustion residuals, is that could be converted into a solar farm. I've also been seeing a lot of wastewater and water treatment plants putting in solar panels. Someone just the other day that had it, and they're using that to offset some of their costs because they're usually in a fairly open area. They may even have it over some of their pools and such. There was one picture I had. Let's see if I can find it real quick. That was of a floating solar farm. So yeah. Here. So I mean, this is a solar farm that appears to just be floating, built on a lake. So any place where you have a reservoir that you're not necessarily using for recreation, or if it's part of a water treatment or wastewater treatment, even offshore, you could potentially have these. Now, Michael mentioned solar paint. So solar paint applied to a surface that will catch your energy from the sun and convert to electricity. May look like it, but now has billions of pieces of light-sensitive material. So that would probably be silicon, or maybe some of the other materials that are light-sensitive. And once it's exposed to light, it would start producing electricity. Now you just need to harness it. The nice thing, Bonnie Roos said that Montana now requires bonding for large wind and solar farms to ensure proper cleanup on decommissioning. So great on Montana for looking ahead to that. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain states that already do have something similar, and I think the number is growing. And with the October changes to record that were proposed, I think we may see more and more people looking at doing that, and especially with large scale from a state government standpoint, start doing this. Like, okay, if you're going to build this, let's have it's going to be similar to the financial assurance for a landfill. Have something in place for when you decommission.
And this is me again. I was aware of a solar farm project in the northwest part of Indiana in White County, a sparsely populated area, but there was some controversy. But apparently, it's going to be operational, or it's mostly operational. But I think the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, I think they might have been a big sponsor. I think the controversy had to do with taking up farmland.
Yeah, that's definitely a potential controversy, but if designed correctly, as I noted, you can have both. It'd be more difficult to have traditional row crops under a solar panel, because then you would not be able to do the mass harvesting that you would have at a large scale commercial farm, because one, your combines or whatever would not be able to get it underneath the solar panels, or they would run over the solar panels. But there is, especially with livestock, there is the option. So long as, I would say don't have goats because the goats may decide to climb on the solar panels, but cows or anything else may be fine.
And Bonnie comments, Montana now requires bonding for large wind and solar farms to ensure proper cleanup upon decommissioning.
Yeah.
So Donovan, this is a great presentation. I really appreciate it. You put your heart and soul into this.
Well, it's one of those things that's like, okay, you ask me to research it, I'll research it.
Yeah. And with that being said, I think there are a number of other people who could potentially speak on a topic that they're very passionate about, as shown by Donovan's presentation. And it would be very interesting for the whole group to hear. Sometimes, you know something and you just assume everyone else knows that same level of knowledge that you do and has that same level of passion. And you may be surprised by sharing with the group what we might get out of it, or we might also be surprised. So the next meeting will be December 19th. We're going to be talking about future technical topics as well as topics for annual training. January, we have a climate and the economic justice screening tool by our very own Mary Esco Baker, who's online now, I think, or maybe got off.
Yeah,
Hey, Mary,
hello.
did you want to do any comment on your presentation or just maybe a teaser?
Yeah, I'll be kind of going over the climate and economic justice screening tool as well as EJ Screen, especially their new version 2.2. So just addressing any changes that we might have seen and the differences between the tools mainly.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And then February, maybe for part of the meeting, there's going to be a lady with OAQPS talking about the PM next making. And I don't have anything more.
Yeah.
Leanne, do you have anything to add? Oh, maybe Leanne's not on. Well,
I
if
think
not,
Leanne dropped, but so I'll send you the presentation so you can include it with the minutes to send out to everybody.
sounds
Um,
great.
Thank you for this opportunity. I know that Abby recorded it as well, so it will be up on the website.
Thank you again. Have a good afternoon, I think, for most of you. Yeah, I think for maybe all of you.
Yeah. All right.
See-
Thank you and have a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy